Hey everybody, Nick Morgan. Welcome back to Capital Ideas, where we celebrate the innovators and disruptors and the capital markets that bring those people to fruition. I'm happy to join you on the latest episode of Capital Ideas with Dara, Mark, and our special guest today.
I'm Mark Hiride, Senior Legal Director and Policy Counsel at ICAN.
And I'm Dara Albright, co-host of Capital Ideas and a proud board member of ICAN. And today, please join us in welcoming Stefan Rust to the podcast. Stefan is a true innovator in the blockchain space. He's built multiple revolutionary platforms, including Truflation, which is a real-time provider of inflation data for smarter financial and economic decisions, and as well as Nuon, which is the world's first stable coin, which is pegged to inflation, used to hedge against inflation and that sort of volatility. Welcome, Stefan. So great to have you on.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me and looking forward to this. Thanks.
Excellent. So maybe we could start a little bit by talking about how does the outdated and unreliable inflation data impact the economy, and especially how does it disproportionately harm smaller investors and retirement savers?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, over the last 5 years, we've experienced about 30% inflation in aggregate. So that means today's purchasing power is 30% less than what it was 5 years ago, which is a significant drop. And largely a lot of the discontent or, dissatisfaction in where the economy's been going is a reflection of that, right? All of a sudden, it's getting a lot more challenging to meet my obligations at the end of the month. If a government doesn't actually adhere to their budgets and they don't follow their budgets and accumulating large amounts of debt, but yet I at home can't even get food on the table because I can't afford those 6 eggs or the dozen of eggs that I need to have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the household, it gets really challenging. And those elements start having a significant impact on every household and every individual. I've been in the blockchain for quite a while. And one thing that when we looked at inflation, we found that it was done very in an old fashioned, still very survey based. You had people collecting pricing information manually. All the meanwhile, the economy had evolved into a digital age, mobile phone, mobile-centric, ADD environment, fast, instantaneous gratification that I was looking for, those dopamine hits. And we were still working in calculating economic indicators manually and monthly. And we had to go back and edit the data because it wasn't accurate, the data that we actually thought we had accumulated accurately. And so we had to go back and edit that. And that was largely why we felt we could make a significant impact into the market and do a significant improvement in terms of that you could feel and see above and beyond what the government was doing to the most important economic scorecard out there, which we felt was the CPI. It drives monetary policy, it drives interest rate policies, and ultimately those impact everybody from businesses, small, medium businesses, large corporations, banks, as well as individuals.
We recently wrote an interesting open letter to Congress and the administration calling for the immediate modernization of inflation data. And you noted that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which publishes the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and the PPI, the Producer Price Index, the leading indices of inflation in this country, you mentioned that they're forced to rely on an increasing volume of statistical distortions. Can you describe some of the ways in which the CPI and the PPI really are not accurate or not as accurate as the data that you're generating?
Yeah, number one, what the BLS has been going through over the last sort of, let's say, 6 months has been a reduction in force. So they've dropped from some 2,000 employees to down to, I don't know how many, but they have a lot of contractors on staff as well, which are not accounted in the FTE numbers. And that is also the second element, which they have had budget reductions as well. So they no longer have the funds available that they used to have in terms of in order to be able to calculate and aggregate the data sets that they have been acquiring in the past. And so now,
Am I correct in the BLS largely still manually collects inflation data? That's why these cutbacks are so dramatically impacting the accuracy of the information. Is that right?
yeah, so there's for lack, I mean, for, Wall Street Journal, give or take what you wanted to around the Wall Street Journal, but they actually had a report go out that said the BLS was using 477 employees manually going out and collecting pricing data at the grocery stores. So they were going to verify that data. What we do is we automatically pull in that data straight from scanners, point of sales scanners that actually track based on barcode data. We know the product, the size, the volume, etc., detailed product descriptions, and then ultimately what that grocery store is charging based on that barcode for the item. And obviously, different stores have different prices for the same item. How do we then aggregate that, normalize that? That's basically a lot of the science, which the data team at Truflation are really have begun to master very well.
And then there's also the fact of manipulation also, because the government could they could say, you know what, eggs have been really pricey this month. We don't want it to appear that inflation is out of control, so let's take eggs out of the basket.
And yeah, I mean, that's what they did with coffee, right? Coffee became too expensive. They took coffee out of the equation. So all of a sudden we couldn't track coffee anymore. We don't add coffee to the mix anymore, which ultimately, and there's this whole substitution element as well. So if you can have chicken, and chicken's a lot more, well, now chickens are pretty expensive, but I mean, if you had instead of steak, you get sausages, that's a good substitution. It's protein. So we can substitute steaks with sausages, for example. Those were things that that were being done. At the same time, we also broke down a lot of the government, or the BLS works with 6 categories. We break it down into 12 categories. So we have more granularity in the details. We extract utility fees and costs out of shelter. We feel that the variability associated with pricing changes in utilities is far greater and should be not included and hidden under a big basket of shelter. So whilst the BLS records some 30% household spending going towards shelter, we actually drop it down to some 23% because we extract 6% out of that as towards utilities. Oil prices, gas prices are way more volatile than your mortgage rates or your rent payments that you have if you're renting.
And Stefan, maybe you could talk a little bit about how investors actually make their own decisions based on this information. I mean, how it changes how they would, impact how much they're going to save for a particular month to put into their retirement plan, let's say. And since you guys have also been, it's not only that you're more accurate, you also have been, am I correct in saying like 60 days ahead of what the actual CPI numbers have been?
Yeah, so we found investors are very interested in our data out of a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is we're 45 days ahead. Once you've identified the signal and you can leverage the data available, and you have a 45-day lead time against that of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. You also identify different patterns associated with alternative investment strategies. So with Truflation and that 45-day lead time, you're also beginning to identify opportunities as it relates to investments into things like Bitcoin, into things like the Dixie, into the 10-year bond yield price and interest rate swaps. So those are new evolving solutions that we've identified together with our users who are actually using the data and subscribing and paying for real-time updates. And that becomes really interesting. So it turns a lot of the data sets that we've actually acquired into financial instruments, not just buying a bond and trading a bond based on the yield, based on inflation numbers and upcoming interest rate changes associated with that old stale data, but now using modern real-time data to actually drive other more macroeconomic decisions and investments. And that's really, for us, super exciting. And seeing that actually Truflation is the only metric that they have against other asset classes is a lot of validation of the 4 years of work that we've put into growing Truflation to where it is today.
The government actually coming in and saying, "Hey, you know what? We're gonna scrap the CPI. They're outdated. They're outmoded. They're not reliable, not accurate. Let's base this on Truflation, or at least on more accurate using in the innovation that we have, like the blockchain." Do you see that's where the future is going?
100%. I mean, I've even actually written out, not in this letter, but I've written out, I would give away the infrastructure for free and access to the data for free. So the beauty, I believe, is not in actually the aggregation of the data, whilst obviously that's a lot of lifting. It's the attestation or the verification of the source of where the data is coming from. That is critical. And then ultimately, leveraging the brains as a means to calculate the best way using verifiable data sets to what is that inflation rate? What is the algorithm? How do we invest our intellect to identify and optimize the calculation and the algorithm for calculating the CPI? And anybody can calculate that CPI if you wanted to. And if you want to come up with a different methodology, have a debate, have an open debate around the methodology and not necessarily around always the source of data. And you can change out the data sets. You can have more data sets. We can then attract additional data providers onto a transparent blockchain where actually, if you want attestation and verification, I only want it from these, and they have to verify that they're providing that to me. That's then when an exchange of financial rewards can be shared and making the calculation all the more accurate and, all the more trusted.
Stefan,
I think that's the big thing, is the trust element. How do we grow trust? And our advantage is we've been around for 4 years. I think we've acquired a certain level of trust. We've been battle tested and still are being battle tested on a regular basis.
I was just going to say, this is not theoretical. You actually assisted Argentina, is that correct? And
yes.
Can you describe what the initiative there?
Yeah, so we did actually also propose to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics how we might be able to work with them. We work together with the National Science Information Research Institute or Institute of Research or something. That was so long ago. But yeah, we actually put a paper together what the economic benefit would be of real-time calculations of inflation, how that would be beneficial for an investment standpoint, what that would mean from an interest rate standpoint, how you don't need to go wait till one day in every 2 months when you can actually come and decide whether we should raise interest rates or not, but you could actually raise and have a much more flexible interest rate policy. But we were not thinking of going into other markets. And in fact, our investors thought we should just stay focused on the US market and get really deep and specialize in the US until we were approached by the Tech Forum, which is an advisory group around modern technologies, to Millet and directly to his team. It's an advisory team that works alongside his government that actually try to modernize technology. One of them was a big fan of Truflation, what we've been doing, and invited us to the table. So we met with the Department of Commerce in Argentina. We said we were going to do the inflation first. Let us just do our own calculation. And they wanted an alternative source of truth in their negotiations with the IMF around renewing some of the loans that they had. Whilst they had their previous head of Commerce, Moreno, was sentenced to jail for fraud in calculating inflation, as the interest rates in the loans from the IMF were pegged to inflation.
Mm.
And so that's when they wanted an independent source of truth that allowed them to say, look, they're saying 8, we're calculating 4 or whatever. It was actually up in the 200% a year-on-year inflation rates, right? And so, yeah, that's so they came and we sort of helped and worked alongside them. Once they saw our metric there, they then sort of handed over to us a lot of their commercial commerce data. And so we work with them to make that commerce data available on the Truth network, which is the blockchain that we've built out, which is open sourced. It is developed in the US by US engineers. It is Postgres database. So it's a SQL language that nearly 80% of all software engineers have worked with SQL in the past. It's a common software language for developers to work with, and it's extremely efficient from a database and data management perspective, where I can write immediately functions and calculations to the Truth network or the blockchain using common language. And so that's been really the advantage. And now that they see that, we are much more engaged with their Department of Commerce to try and bring new data sets, maybe support them in their own calculation of inflation using the Truth network.
Fascinating. Do you see them using Nuon as a product that they may offer as it to peg against, inflation?
Yeah, so Nuon originally it was a bit of an experiment, and we launched Nuon as a means to provide inflation protection to anybody that held a dollar. And so it was dollar pegged with inflation US economic inflation protection, right? So that's sort of really the benchmark. That was the experiment. It went through a couple of iterations, and obviously under the last regulation, it was definitely a bit sensitive. It could be deemed a security. It could be viewed as a TIPS equivalent, where you have a treasury inflation protected security. It has securities in the name. We'd have to get an application for that. And we just weren't ready to go through that process. And so we held it quiet, really just with testing with the market, trying to find a product market fit for it, to be honest. Today, we have relaunched it. And the output is still, you give a stable coin into a smart contract on the blockchain, and in return, you receive a Nuon. And the Nuon is an inflation protected, still doesn't change. However, the assets backing the inflation protection, the Nuon itself and the inflation protection are yield-bearing vaults, but to a large extent, it's inflation-correlated assets, where you have tokenized assets like gold, silver, oil, S&P 500, and Bitcoin. And those are actually inflation-correlated, highly inflation-correlated. And so when inflation is greater than what yield you can earn in savings on the blockchain, then ultimately that stockpile becomes the backing associated with providing inflation protection.
So interesting. I saw that you had posted something on LinkedIn a couple of weeks back talking about Robinhood's acquisition of Bitstamp. And I know we're seeing a lot of M&A activity from, more conventional players in the financial industry to blockchain platforms, et cetera. And how do you see that impacting the industry itself? How could that impact protocols like Truflation? And how do you think that will just really, impact the capital markets, and especially the democratization of the capital markets?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much packed into that.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I mean, it's a 180-degree turn to where we were 12 months ago, right? I mean, the last 6 months have been a phenomenal turnaround, a very big support towards the blockchain and cryptocurrencies, especially stablecoins. I think the Genius Act is genius. It is going to inject, I mean, two things. It's going to solve the debt issue, I think, to a large extent. It's going to actually maybe a couple more issues. It's going to drive dollar dominance around the world, and it's going to bring about a whole new set of liquidity into the market in a whole new currency form. And it's going to go so fast that I think people have no idea how much new money is going to come into the market. Yeah.
Well, while we're waiting to see what happens with the Genius Act, obviously at ICAN, we're concerned with regulatory barriers to innovators. What are some of the regulatory barriers you're currently facing that might need some attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole securities, what is a security in this age of digital age? How do you tackle geographical barriers in a world where the internet is global? It's digital. The blockchain is so transparent. There's no privacy on the blockchain. I mean, you can follow every wallet. You can see all the assets in there. You can see the trading, who it's interacting with. Okay, it's not the easiest to navigate, but once you get a handle of it, it's mathematics and it's formulas, and I can follow everything. I can filter it all out, and it will become very transparent. Yet at the same time, again, I have customers worldwide. How do you deal with the different jurisdictions? I think that's definitely one thing. I think all jurisdictional, requirements and specifications and regulations are going to be coming out of the US, and they're really going to influence the rest of the world.
And I suppose you could sort of turn that telescope around and say that within the United States, we might see some active state regulators, for example, New York or California. Have state regulators popped up much with what you're doing?
No, not at all. I think Texas has been the most liberal out of the lot. There are laws popping up. California wants to take dormant wallets and take their crypto assets if nobody's been claiming the crypto assets in a Kraken account for the last 5 years, or I don't know the exact number, then we can claim that. Europe's making a similar type of notion where dormant savings accounts should be claimed and be given back to the European governments. So there are different types of states that are and countries and nations that are trying different things. But there's definitely, I think what is good in the US is we've got now the OCC having a bigger influence in regulatory frameworks at a state level, right? They're going to be more decentralized. It's not necessarily going to be the Fed that has an influence over stablecoins. It's going to be the OCC, which I think is going to decentralize a lot more. And we'll see there's definitely a push away from centralized power to more decentralizing the influence at a state level, which will bring about more competition between the states, which I think will be interesting.
Yeah.
We'll have more competition on currencies. I think every bank is going to have their own stablecoin. I'm sitting on 100 billion in bonds. And by the way, it's not going to be T-bills. They're not going to be 3-year bonds or 3-month bonds. They're going to be 10-year bonds. So I have to hold on to the money for 10 years, and then I can mint, exactly that same amount 1-to-1, as a stable coin. And I'm going to have the JP Morgan coin. I'm going to have the Bank Republic Bank coin. I'm going to have the Wells Fargo coin. There are going to be so many coins out there, but they're all going to be dollars. So it doesn't really matter. It's just going to have a different, maybe a different symbol associated with it. But ultimately, they're all going to be swappable. Yeah. And so there's going to be a huge, influx in different types of stable coins. And then again, it's going to come down to trust. Who do you trust? Who's going to have the longest staying power?
And
who's
not
the
all
biggest
will be-
distribution? Sorry?
Right. Not all of them will be pegged to inflation.
Yeah, exactly. So then you're going to have different differentiation factors. I don't think, so I'm not sure from a regulatory standpoint, but one of the regulations is yield bearing or not yield bearing. In the past, that has been a big debate. Can stablecoins be yield bearing? Can the yield from staking Ethereum, for example, can that be passed on to the purchasers of an ETF in Ethereum, for example? Those have all been big debates, right? The interest or the earnings associated with stablecoins. And I think in the Genius Act, stablecoins are not allowed to be interest bearing or yield bearing.
Interesting. Well, hopefully, one of the issues there in the past was which regulator had the jurisdiction to answer that question. So hopefully the Genius Act will at least tell us, where we should be looking for the answer to that question.
And there's a difference between custodial services and self-custodial services. We've been very much focused on never taking the user's funds. We just don't want that responsibility. How do we leverage the blockchain as a means to securing the user's funds based on their permissions, with their keys to their safety deposit box, that all that safety deposit box is there, sits on the blockchain, and it's in their control. And the beauty of Nuon is instant redemption. So if you want redemption right away, you don't need to wait, file a notice 30 days in advance, wait 6 months, and then at the next time in October 9th, 2020, whatever, you can then redeem it only on these 2 days or something. You can actually come in right away, swap it out, deposit, and you redeem in USDC or USDT, or maybe in the future JPM coin, or whatever the dollar, exactly, is that you use as a staking element.
Well, we live in exciting times, and you're part of that, Stefan. So maybe we'll leave it there for this interview, but obviously it sounds like we're on the cusp of this mass proliferation of different kinds of stable coins, and we'll be a part of that. So hopefully we can check back in with you and see how it's going sometime in the future. So thanks so much for coming on.
No, thank you. Anytime.
Dara and Mark, thank you again for hosting as usual. Everyone else, if you want more information about ICAN, go to icanlaw.org, and we'll see you on the next Capital Ideas. Thank you.